Welcome to One Word Stories. My name is Joanna Zell, and I'm tremendously happy to greet a very special guest of mine, Milton Bennett. A very warm welcome, Milton.
Hi, nice to be here. Thanks.
Thank you for accepting my invitation. Milton is very, very known in the intercultural field for fantastic insights, for the very, very up-to-date research. He comes to all the conferences with something new all over again. And actually, this is also something that surprised me personally when I was searching information about you, Milton. You bring a very, very general knowledge to the table. So before actually studying the psycholinguistics and also doing your PhD in intercultural communication at the University of Minnesota, you graduated also from English literature, creative writing, and physics at the Stanford University. So maybe this also brings an idea why you have compared the philosophy and the different streams in social sciences with physics. Very, very interesting comparison. And of course, a lot of people know you as the co-founder of the Intercultural Communication Institute in Portland, but also your own institute in Portland and also in Milano, where you are based right now. So you are the founding director of the Intercultural Development Research Institute. And last but not least, very important, the author of the DMIS, so Developmental Model of Intercultural Sensitivity, which is very, very well known in the field. So,
thank you.
Milton, one very important question. When we talk about this shift from the positivism, relativism to the constructivism, all these words are, yes, pretty complex. So, of course, it would take us lots of time to explain every single thing. But my question is actually what brought you to this idea to put the intercultural field into this comparison with physics?
Well, probably, as you said, I bring that scientific background. It turned out, as I was studying physics, that I was far more interested in the philosophy of science than I was in actually doing it. So that's why I think I ended up with a creative writing degree. But the philosophy of science is basically about epistemology. It's about how it is that we know what we know. And the paradigms in science, as famously spoken about by Thomas Kuhn in The Structure of Scientific Revolution, which is, some people have told me, the most quoted book in the Western world next to the Bible. It's like, everybody who writes a scientific article with a thought to the philosophy of science quotes Thomas Kuhn. And so it's not an unusual idea to position a scientific enterprise into a paradigm. It's just that physical science tends to do that more. They tend to realize that they're using a more Newtonian view or a more Einsteinian view or a more quantum view of the world in terms of its epistemology. Social science doesn't have the same tradition of philosophy of science. So I've always thought it was kind of a lack within social science to not be able to position what it's doing similarly to physical science in some kind of a paradigm, some epistemology. So that's the reason for making the crossover, between the two areas. There's some good reason, I think, although it's not a very popular view, and I don't see a lot of other people saying it, but to me, it looks as if social science incorporates the paradigm shifts that occur in physical science, but with a lag. So first, physical science is using the Newtonian view, a positivist view as it comes into social science through Comte in sociology. Basically, positivism is the idea that there is a real reality out there and that we can describe that reality accurately or not accurately, that every observer who looks in the same direction will see the same thing, you know,
Exactly, that it's objective.
if they're looking at it correctly, because there is an objective reality out there, exactly. And that idea, when it came into social science, became the basis of sociology, which is the attempt to describe accurately human behavior and then to predict it, and as a result of predicting it, to be able to control it. You know, not in any bad way, but just in, I think it was a well-intended improvement in human relations initially. Well, then the physicists, you know, stopped using the Newtonian view and sort of shifted over to the Einsteinian view towards the beginning of the last century, and that was quickly mirrored in anthropology with the idea of cultural relativity. So cultural relativity really follows the Einsteinian idea that there may be a real reality, but we only have our perspective on it because we exist in our context. And as a result, you know, we're limited in our perception of the world to more or less that context. We can imagine outside of that context, but basically we're in that context. And that idea in anthropology became cultural relativity, where each culture, rather than being one form of civilization, you know, and then typically either a more civilized form of civilization or a barbarian or even savage form of civilization. That's the sort of one reality idea. The multiple reality idea or at least the multiple perspective idea of Einsteinian relativity was in social science became the idea of multiple sort of equal but different cultures. The third paradigm of constructivism, which was generated more or less as quantum physics initially at the beginning of last century, but as it moved into social science, moved in kind of sideways. And one of the main places that it moved into was communication theory. That human communication theory was all about the mutual construction of meaning. And the epistemology underlying human communication theory was that we are in the process of constructing a reality. For all practical purposes, you and I, as we're having this conversation, are constructing at least a social reality, if not, in a larger sense, a physical reality. And that it's the construction of that reality which is the most meaningful thing for us as human beings in our interaction with one another. And this idea was fairly common around the middle of last century. The early interculturalists picked up on that idea, and in my opinion, I've written a few things about this that try to support this. In my opinion, early intercultural communication was in fact based on constructivism. It wasn't based on cultural relativity predominantly. It was based in constructivism, and it used cultural relativity, but it really wasn't lodged there. It was lodged more in this idea of the construction of meaning. And Edward T. Hall has, you know, a lot of history of being able to do that kind of coming from that perspective. So that's why, first of all, I think it's important for us to be looking at paradigms, but secondly, why it is that I think intercultural work really was founded initially on constructivist principles, and in some ways that has been lost.
Yeah, definitely. Because when I listen to your description, I immediately think of course, the founding fathers, so to say, of the intercultural field, predominantly Edward T. Hall, who actually, you say, was a little bit tempted by the constructivist approach.
I believe so.
Also can be identified with the relativist approach, doesn't he?
Well, I think less than he typically is. That his idea of culture as communication, which he was very clear about, was that we as human beings are coordinating with one another, meaning in action within these groups that have these boundaries around them. And when we want to interact with a different group, we have to figure out how to make this bridge where we create a mutual construction of meaning between these two different coordinating systems, a kind of meta coordination, I call it right now. And I think that he was onto that idea initially. I've spoken with him personally about this, and I'm convinced from the conversation that I've had that this was what he had in mind. He was also influenced by Traeger, who was the linguist that he was working with, who in turn was very familiar with the Whorf-Sapir hypothesis and the other kinds of that are more constructivist rather than relativist ideas. Now, the relativism has come into the field more predominantly in two ways. One of them with an emphasis on anthropology, which in fact was based in cultural relativism more specifically, I would say, and then more recently through critical theory. And critical theory is heavily relativist. It's very, very oriented towards people being lodged in a context. The whole idea of deconstruction is really to look at the context that defines people's perspective. So it's almost like a super relativism that drives critical theory, and critical theory has in turn influenced, as it has many social sciences, intercultural communication.
So actually one question that is not politically correct. If the positivist approach is actually this approach of yesterday, and all of us, we are aware of the fact that Gerd Hofstede, von Strompeners, and also other researchers are or were actually tempted to build their research according to the positivist framework.
With the exception of Charles Hampton Turner, who works with Trompenauers, but himself is extremely constructivist in his view. So I'd like to exempt Charles from that list. But otherwise, yes, there's a list of people who are largely positivist in their view. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry to interrupt you. And the question.
No. It's the question is, why is this approach still so popular? I mean, of course, it's about this aspect of reducing complexity, and we want to have something objective. We want to have data and facts and all this stuff that we can make decisions.
But you could argue that trying to understand the phenomenon in terms of objective facts is not something that has turned out very well. And that's we continue to try to understand the world in a sensical way. We try to make sense of the world in a way that allows us to interact with the world more or less predictably. There are alternative ways to doing that outside of establishing linear causality, which is that original sort of Newtonian positivist view. I think that there are two reasons why this remains kind of popular in the social sciences in general, including intercultural. And one of them is that our research tools are based in positivism. Most of the attempts to establish significance, for instance, are basically trying to establish the likelihood of our discovering the actual condition, or looking at the actual causal relationship that's going on, or at least the likelihood of that being the case. And so I think part of it is we are constrained by our research tools. The other part of it is what I started out saying, which is we lack a philosophy of science within social science to recognize that we're using those kinds of tools.
Yeah, thank you. Because this is also something that brings us, of course, a little bit to this narrative turn. And on one hand side, don't misunderstand me. Of course, we need data. Yeah, we need data. We need also mega data. We need lots of data that we can also make decisions. This is no question. Nevertheless, in order to have meaningful conversations, we also need narratives. We also need stories. We also need the subjective aspects that we can relate to. And this is actually also something that is, of course, very, very important in the constructivism. so that we are aware of the fact that we co-create the stories, that we co-create also these narratives, also global narratives currently, but also narratives at the collective level. And these narratives, these huge narratives, are changing. So when we think of different generations, obviously they see different phenomena much, much differently than their older colleagues. And it's nothing new. Nevertheless, due to the digitalization and this really huge, huge transformation in the social behaviors and social media and so on and so forth, it's really very, very rapid and fast. So when I think of your model, the DMIS, I immediately have to think of this constructivist approach, and also this thing that maybe I can quote Václavík at this moment: you cannot not communicate. So even if people don't say how they see migrant waves, how they feel in a new place where they relocated, and so on and so forth, their body language, their eye contact, and all of that also discloses this piece of information. And what I would like to ask you is to bring a couple of ideas and also stories that the 6 stages of the model are getting very, very vivid, so to say.
Let me go back to something you started out with, which is we need data. However, we should remember that data is also the result of stories. You know, we tell a story, and then we go out and we look for data to either support or not support that story. So the story that we have, it could be a theory, you know, which is just a simple kind of story, right? You know, it's sort of an abstract story, but nevertheless, it's a story about how things are working in the world. That story is what it is that then drives what we ask about, which we in turn then use certain methods to try to assess the answers that we get, whether they be quantitative answers or qualitative answers. But we ought not to think that the data that we are collecting is in some way more objective than a story, because it comes from a story. It's just, you know, it's just the answer to the question that we ask as a result of that story. So, you know, just to say that, you know, just to support the idea that yes, we're talking about stories, and even when we talk about data, we're talking about stories. All right, so let's go to the story of the DMIS, you know, which of course is a story. It's the story of how people get better at becoming interculturally competent, of basically having the experience of otherness, as I'm talking about it these days. As I'm trying to broaden what was always the intention of the model, which was to apply to the relationship to otherness, not just to international cultural differences, which, as you probably know, the reason why Intercultural has such an international focus is that that's what corporations were paying for. And so people who were going out and trying to earn a living doing this, we're talking about national cultural differences. Yeah. But in fact, the field started out with contrast to Native American cultures, and there were all kinds of other forms of cultural otherness that were part of the formation of intercultural communication. It wasn't particularly focused on international differences to begin with. But it's kind of become that way. So a couple of stories about the story of how we get better at this, and some of them, you know, coming from my own experience. The way I did the DMIS was as a piece of grounded theory. What that means is you go out and you observe what people are doing, and then you try to make sense of it. And the observation is your perception, your selection of behavior to pay attention to. And in making sense of it is then what's the explanation? Why are people doing it? Why does it happen in that direction? And the explanation that I used, as you know, I borrowed from Piaget and the general perceptual constructivists, I think we can call them, who are the people who say that we learn things, we human beings learn things by layering perception. we begin by perceiving things in very vague categories, such as that's, that's an animal, and this is not an animal, or that's an animal with 4 legs, but we don't distinguish the horses from the cows from the dogs initially, but then we have those additional categories that we use and so forth, and that this layering of categories allows us to have more and more discriminate, meaning more finely distinguished differences within these categories, and that's how we learn things, and that everybody who's an expert in whatever they're an expert in can do that very well. As a grounded theory, the DMIS goes through these points along the continuum. I'm not sure they're really stages. It's not like you move from one stage to the next, and like life stage models, Erickson or people like that. Those are more life stage models. This is not that kind of a model. It's more a model of how it is that we would go about layering perception vis-a-vis otherness. And the initial stage of it, as you know, is denial. And what I mean by denial, by the way, each of these stages is named for the experience that goes along with it. So the experience of denial is the experience of not noticing, of not having any categories, basically, or very vague categories for otherness. An example of that is I grew up in a small town in Oregon. It's about 5,000 people. And we were at that point a farming area. It's now a wine growing area, but at the time there were beans and strawberries were the main crops around there, and hazelnuts. It's kind of like filberts, we call them. It's like that kind of nut. Trona. And in any case, not only did the kids from the school go out and pick these crops during the summer, which we all did, that was what we did during the summer, but there were not enough of us to pick all the crops. So there were also so-called migrant workers that largely were from Mexico that came up, and there were villages, and this village was called Iola Village, which is where the migrant workers lived during the time that they were picking the crops, and then they would either go back to Mexico or go around and pick crops in other areas, other kinds of crops. That's the term, migrant workers. Every once in a while, we townies would see somebody walking through town that we didn't recognize. And we would say, must be somebody from Iola Village. And that was the last we thought about it. We never, ever went, none of us went to Iola Village. None of us ever had any interaction with any of those migrant workers. They were existing, but more or less invisible in our experience. We had nothing against them. We just didn't have anything about them. That's what I mean by denial. It's the failure to experience something. We failed to experience the migrant workers who lived in Iola Village. Eola Hills, by the way, is now the name of a famous winery in that area. So times change. Defense, the next stage, is when you start noticing. And when you start noticing otherness, your initial response is not, oh, isn't that wonderful otherness? Your initial response is, oh my God, they're out to get us, or there's some kind of a threat, that this is, of course, wired in. This is our genetic heritage, species heritage. Is to fear otherness as a potential threat, and better to think something's a threat and be cautious than to think it's not a threat and be dead, So that was that's our heritage as primates. So as we notice this otherness more, we either get into a kind of negative stereotyping of the other, which is a frequent sort of form of ethnocentrism, or the reversal. And my experience is a little bit more with the reversal. I go back to my Peace Corps volunteer days when I lived a couple of years out in Micronesia on a little 1 square mile island out in the Western Pacific. And after about a year, I recall extolling the wonders of this society, which was I could perceive in relatively complex ways. I had a kind of romanticized view of that society as being, a more or less perfect place where everybody shared everything, where food grew on the trees, that nobody was hungry, and as opposed to the terrible, materialistic, awful place that I came from, which was the United States. So this was an example. I call it reversal, where I'm in a stage of defense. But in this case, I'm defending my romantic vision, which is still a simple vision, a simplified vision, an exotified, as the term is sometimes used, vision of the other. But I'm then criticizing in far more complex ways my own society. Well, then the next position really is the minimization, and in the minimization, we're drawn to the idea that we're all just human. And in many ways, it's the counter to defense, where we move to minimization and we say, we're all just human, and we all eat, sleep, procreate, defecate, and die. What's the problem here? We just need to comment. We just need to emphasize our common humanity. And I'm not sure if this was the derivation of it, but I remember thinking that a really good example of that is the ride at Disneyland or Disney World, which is called "It's a Small World After All." And there's a little song, "It's a small world after all." It's a small...
Exactly.
Yeah, right. Yeah. and the little dolls, you may remember, the little dolls they're all dressed in different costumes, and they're all singing in different languages until you get to the end, and they're all dressed in white, and they're all singing in English. Honestly, it really is true. I had to go through all the rides everywhere in the world
I know
just
it.
to
Yeah, I'm familiar with
But anyway,
it.
it's sort of that small world kumbaya idea.
Yeah.
Nothing, and of course, this is not to say that people are not commonly human. We are. We're all human beings, and we do share certain universal values. Very, very kind of abstract values. Parents love their children, that sort of thing. But if we stop there, sometimes I say it's a good thing to do, but a bad place to stop.
Yeah, exactly.
If we stop there, then we're in this condition of, we're all just human, and we're in fact refusing to acknowledge the equal but different complexity of other people. In other words, we continue to be ethnocentric, I think, in that we impose our idea of what common humanity is on everyone in the world. And we tend to think that deep down there are certain things that apply to everybody in the world, including human rights. And once we say, whether you know it or not, you have human rights, at that point, we are making a minimization assumption. And it's pretty ethnocentric. Maybe other people don't think that human rights as we define them apply to everybody in the world. Do we know the truth better than them? That wouldn't be very culturally relative, would it? All right. So then we move to acceptance, which is the recognition that other people are, in fact, equally complex to you. And this is really the important thing, is the equal complexity of otherness. So this is what allows us to experience other people empathically. If we try to empathize with others before we acknowledge equal complexity, all we're doing is empathizing with a stereotype, with a romanticized version. Could be a positive stereotype, but with a romanticized version of the other. We're not really having the experience of otherness. We're having the experience of our idealization of the other. And so for us to have empathic experience that is meaningful to the other person, we need to recognize the equal but different complexity of other. And I try to practice this, and I think other people can do that too. Maybe people do in general, I don't know. But when I'm walking down the street, I look at people that are different from me. And they just look different than me, and it's easy to do here in Milan, where I'm speaking from Milan now. There are lots of, immigrants from all over the world here in Milan. And as I look at those people, rather than saying, oh, there's somebody who looks Bangladeshi, I try to go beyond that and say, yeah, it's a person maybe from Bangladesh. What kind of experience are they having here in Milan? What are they doing here? How long have they been here? Is this a place where they're able to raise their family? And I'm sort of interested in the idea of, do they think it's cool to be here in Milan? I think it's kind of cool to be here in Milan. Do they think it's kind of cool, or is it just a place where there's a job? How does that work? It seems to me that asking these kinds of questions, even if you don't know the answer, is acknowledging the equal complexity of the other. even though you may not know what the form of that complexity is. And that in turn then allows you to move to the adaptation, or the ability to not only take the perspective of the other in a reasonably complex way, but then to modify your own behavior in a way that takes into account that otherness. And that may be a one-way adaptation, meaning that you may recognize that an adaptation needs to be made. It's a small thing, but I was getting on the elevator downstairs just this morning coming to this talk, and there were a couple of people that came up that might want to get on the elevator with me, and they both had on masks. So I have a mask. I carry a mask around with me. I put my mask on. Yeah. How much trouble is that? So, they're going to feel better coming into the elevator because they're obviously wearing masks. I'll put my mask on. I could not, but in this case, I'll put it on. That's a one-way adaptation. The more complex adaptations are ones where we're working together in multicultural situations, and we have to decide, how to do something other than when in Rome, do as the Romans, because
Exactly.
like everywhere is Rome. So, like, how do we do the mutual adaptation that create those sort of what I call the virtual third culture spaces, where we do the interaction. And finally, that then allows for what I call integration, which is the ability to think in these terms in our sort of everyday decision-making and ethical work. I mean, those are complex stories. When there's this direct opposition, Europeans, for instance, feel this about guns, and they see Americans with these guns, and thinking that it's okay to have guns or capital punishment. I'm not sure if those go together, but I suppose they do. That Europeans have a difficult time, at least many of them I spoke to, seeing that as something that they could adapt to. They say, it's just wrong. It's just like, there's no question about it. That's a wrong thing. You can't have people with guns, and you can't have a state that's basically murdering its own citizens as a punishment. And but nevertheless, Europeans and Americans need to be working together. So how does that work? Do you just not talk about that? Or if you do, how do you respectfully acknowledge the perspective of the other in such a way that you also can respectfully disagree? And in my opinion, that needs to be a two-way process. Because if it's a one-way process, then whoever it is that's more adamant, ends up exercising power in that situation. But for it to be a shared power situation, there needs to be a mutual acceptance of the idea that we are disagreeing about something that we're equally respectful of. That I can be respectful but disagree with the fact that you believe that every citizen should have a gun because only good citizens with guns can kill the bad guys who have guns. So I need to somehow, be able to talk about that in a way that's respectful of a person who has that view. At the same time, that I can expect that person to be respectful of my view that the world is in fact more dangerous when people have guns that and are trying to enforce civility on one another, by being armed, that I also am recognized for and respected for that view, and that we can then recognize that we're operating with two different views of what is good in the world, and that we are equally sincere and equally human in our commitment to these views of how to be in the world. That doesn't stop us from then working, each of us, to make the world more in the way that we think the world should be. But that doesn't include killing the other person.
Yeah.
I mean, which is, of course, one way to make the world that way. However, when we kill the other people, like Putin is trying to do in Ukraine, when we kill everybody that disagrees with us, then we're not engaged in effective multicultural relations. We are engaged in literally primitive behavior. We are primates who are trying to wipe out the other group of primates because they might take our resources or we want their land. you know. And yes, we've spent a couple 100,000 years doing that. Do we want to continue
Exactly.
in that vein? And if not, well, you know, we need to figure out some way to live together that doesn't include killing people we disagree with.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, when you also right now relate to this respectful disagreement, this is also something that is obviously very, very important in terms of self-reflection and also knowing what is important to us. And our consciousness, also our collective consciousness, is changing.
When we think of it broadly, you can think of lots of examples where we are directly opposed with other people about what kind of a world we want to live in. And that's the question I think we should, not what's right, because the moment that we say what's right, we're saying there is a universal system which we know about and you don't, which if you only were thinking about reality correctly, the way we are, you would agree with us. That's positivist. That's absolutist. That is ethnocentric. That is imperialistic colonialism. That is all of the things that we say we disagree with when we make a statement like that. And yet, what about ethical commitment? You know, what about being committed to the way of the world that we want to live in? It's not a matter of saying anything goes, you know.
Exactly.
I mean, and so the alternative to absolutism is not relativism. This is the whole point of this paradigm thing that we started out talking about, is that if you only think that there is either relativism or absolutism, and you come up against these ethical issues, you tend to then retreat back to absolutism and say, well, except in this case, and then it's absolutely right, and that you're absolutely wrong. Once you say there is an absolute right and wrong, then you put yourself on whatever the absolute right side is, and that gives you the right to kill the people that are absolutely wrong because they're evil. The third possibility is that we're making it up. The third possibility is that we are constructing these positions. And if we are constructing these positions, then it means that we are engaged in equally human activity based on a difference in what kind of a world we think the world should be.
As I said, we also need more and more discussions about ethical issues in the public sphere, also in the businesses.
If you were to ask me, where are we going? I would say this is where we're going. We're going into more and more sophisticated discussion of these kinds of ethical issues, and that allow us to think about ethics as a commitment to a way of being in the world, rather than a conviction that there is a truth and that we have it and that other people should agree with us.
Yeah. Milton, thank you very, very much. It was fascinating to hear to the stories behind the 6 stages of the model, and of course the entire discussion about the paradigm shifts. Actually, I would like to ask you one more question. This time a more personal question. When you think of such tough times, and for different people it means different times.
Well, the word that I would use, that I've been using a lot, is the word experience. And by experience, I don't mean experiential education or anything like that. I mean the idea that we human beings have the capability of generating experience. And assumedly other animals and are having experiences. Maybe inanimate objects are having experiences, but when we think of experience, we generally think of the ability for us to be aware that something is happening, to tell a story and be aware that we're telling the story about something, that we have that experience. It seems to me that experience and its relationship to perception is what it is that gives us 2 really important things. One of them is that it gives us agency, meaning that it gives us the ability to construct our experience, to construct a story, and in so doing, to construct a way of being in the world that we think would be a good way of being in the world. And the second thing it gives us is the responsibility for our stories, that we can't say, oh, that's a story that is outside of us, because all stories come from us. So we have both the freedom, but to create the story, but also the responsibility for exactly the same thing. That's what I mean by experience.
So exactly the issue with the commitment in the ethical way.
See, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Thank you very, very much. I wish you all the best for all your projects. Thank you for this fascinating insights.
Thank you for the opportunity. It's been fun talking with you.